So I'm going to start off today with a thank you, just as I did yesterday. Thank you for being here under what would I have to assume is under the best of circumstances unusual, right? Unusual circumstances. We're all taking some extra effort and time to be here today, and I want to acknowledge that and say how much I appreciate it. And I also want to say with complete candor that I think that the conversation we have today is going to be well worth the time. I think we have an essential set of conversations ahead of us today. And although no one would wish this COVID-19 situation on any of us, I do think that the situation actually makes the conversation we're going to have today a little bit more timely than we would have anticipated maybe just a few months ago. I really wish we're having this event in Chicago, and I just I can envision this community in a room where we could be gathering and for coffee in the hallways and getting a chance to mingle and spend time together. That's something I'm acutely missing as the new president of CRL. I really want to be meeting you in person. But so maybe I would just take a moment and just reflect on who's with us today virtually, because it's actually an extraordinary and rare group. We have library directors and AULs and department heads and librarians and staff from all different areas of library work, whether it's curators or e-resource librarians or metadata librarians. So it's librarians from all across the research library, in organizations all across the United States, all across Canada, and also representing all sorts of different institutional settings. So large ARL and Carl libraries and liberal arts colleges, mid-sized public universities. It really is a very diverse and rich set of perspectives and expertise that, when brought together, represents the research library community at scale. It's a pretty exciting group, and it's a pretty exciting audience. And I'm delighted we're having this chance, today. And I really look forward to getting together in person when we're able to do that in the future. It's an extraordinary group. You're an extraordinary group. A couple housekeeping things. As I mentioned yesterday, CRL really needs to step up its visibility in its social media game. So I just want to point out the Twitter hashtag there. There's the CRL Twitter hashtag is there. So those of you that are very active on social media, I encourage you to go ahead and use that. And without much further ado, I just want to launch into the topic today. And before I turn things over to Roger, I want to sort of set some contextual, give some context to why I think this morning's discussion is so important and so timely. So I talked yesterday about the theme of the meeting. It's context and community. And when I first envisioned the program, the context I was thinking about was the scholarly communications crisis, the context of crisis and knowledge production and knowledge sharing. And that crisis context has only been amplified and intensified, perhaps, with the COVID-19 situation. But the context was challenges we're facing locally, challenges we're facing at scale, and what can we do at scale to address those challenges. In the community, our part was how do we come together as a community and leverage the diversity of expertise and the goodwill in our community to work together to address those challenges and make headway against those challenges locally and at scale. The community is a good thing, right? Community is the antidote, community is the solution to these problems. But what I'm really excited about with Roger's paper and the conversation we're going to have today is that community it's actually much more complicated. Community is expensive. Collaboration is expensive. It takes time and attention. It takes overhead in terms of resources and travel. So community structured the right way with the right governance model, the right business model, right? Community working with the right mission in alignment and partnership with other organizations. Community structured the right way can be very, very, very powerful. But I think it's also fair to say that community not structured optimally could actually not be as useful as we might want it to be. And I think that in this post-COVID-19 environment, it only intensifies some much-needed transformations we in the research library community need to do, looking at our consortial activities and looking at all these different partnerships and really trying to rationalize them and really try to make them work together optimally so that they're working harmoniously and not at cross purposes. Really minimize duplication, merge where we can merge, find partnerships where we can partner, and in areas where we sunset, we sunset. And I think these are really necessary conversations, because if we're going to come together as a community to work to solve common challenges, we really need to think intentionally about how we're structuring this community engagements. And so I'm going to turn it over to Roger, because Roger wrote a paper about a year ago that really lays out all of these opportunities and challenges in the consortial space just beautifully. I've read this paper more times than I can count now, because I think he really gets the challenges on the table well. Roger's now, as of yesterday, a member of the CRL board of directors, so he's part of the CRL community. So I'm very happy about this, because Roger can come now and just lay out all the challenges we have. But then he's got skin in the game. He's here with CRL to help us help CRL position ourselves going forward. And one or two sentences about Roger. I've admired Roger for as long as I've had a professional librarian career. He's been one of the most astute observers of the research enterprise for nearly 2 decades now. I think he was scarcely out of college when he wrote the seminal book on JSTOR. I think it was 2003, Princeton University Press. And since that time, he's just been either leading or co-leading just really seminal studies on all aspects of the research enterprise, whether it's the future of subject specialist librarians, history librarians, whether it's the digital preservation, and right up to the recent study that he co-authored with Lisa Hinchcliffe on academic library response to COVID-19. So if anyone has their fingers on the pulse of the research library enterprise, it's Roger Schoenfeld. I'm delighted to turn things over to Roger. Roger, thank you so much for being here today.
Greg, thank you. Thank you so much for that incredibly kind introduction. I have to say it's a highlight of my professional career to have a chance to join the CRL board and have a chance to serve this community, your community, our community in this way, and I'm really looking forward to that. So I thank you and the nominating committee and the membership for entrusting that responsibility with me. And I'd like to thank you, Greg, for your leadership in pulling this event together, that of your colleagues as well. I know we would all rather be together face to face. And so I just want to acknowledge you and really all the CRL staff for all the work that I know that you're doing in this period of disruption. My task before me today is to talk about restructuring library collaboration. And I'd like to talk very candidly about some of the challenges that I think we're all seeing, but perhaps, thread them together into some themes and think together as a result about some of the opportunity that we're hopefully going to see. I'll be pointed in some of my observations, but that's only because I think by being more direct in appraising our collaborations than we typically have been able to do or have chosen to do, and we actually learn the lessons that we need to learn and make the kinds of restructuring that I certainly believe is necessary. And let me start by just saying a word or two about scale, because when we talk about collaborating, we sometimes find ourselves in talking about collaboration almost for its own sake. But my view is that libraries have long sought out scale beyond their own institutional home, their own higher education institution, their own college or university. And as we all know, they've created an array of consortia, various kinds of collaborative vehicles like CRL, like HathiTrust, like many others that are designed to seek the kind of scale that they need for the services that they need to provide. But what's happened, especially in the transition from print to electronic formats and some of the other ways that the role and the mission of the library and the academic enterprise have shifted as a result, is that the collections and services that are needed by academia have changed, and libraries have faced an information landscape that's broader than ever before, that's full of competition for some of the traditional roles that they provide. And it is in that respect that scale is actually existential for individual libraries today as they think about how to provide collections and services in both efficient and needed ways at scale in an increasingly competitive information environment. My kind of starting point is that organizations, and here I mean libraries by organizations, but this would be true if your organization were a publisher and you were thinking of your membership organizations also. But the libraries should expect their collaborative vehicles to stay in sync with the changes that they have both in their own objectives and in the broader context in which they operate. This is something that might sound like a truism, but the reality is that collaborative vehicles, for a variety of ways that I'm going to be talking about in the presentation, have often become out of sync with changes in their members' objectives and changes in the broader context in which they operate. And so in a way, my talk is really designed to help us all think through how do we bring that back into alignment. As Greg kindly mentioned, many of the thoughts in the presentation are drawn from a paper from just a little more than a year ago. But I've continued, and which is on our website. I believe it's linked to from the CRL event page as well. But I've been continuing to gather observations, and so you'll see some things in the presentation that go beyond what's in the paper. I want to spend maybe 5 minutes talking about history here. If I could go back today for a PhD, it would absolutely be in history, because I think that the methodologies that historians bring us are ones that help us understand our organizational context better than almost any other tools we have available to us. And the history that I see in our community around collaboration, I'm going to suggest three different components to it. One is around resource sharing. This is the dream of having a collection that's almost universal, that's delivered as efficiently, as seamlessly as resources enable. And we can trace our collaborations around resource sharing back a century or more. Some of the earliest efforts to build networks around interlibrary lending, then to develop union catalogs to increase efficiency, various kinds of library systems, which I'll speak a little bit more about, to drive that to scale in a digital environment. Resource sharing is clearly a fundamental part of the collaboration that libraries have sought, the scale that sought. Since we're talking about not just about CRL today, but at a meeting about CRL today for the CRL community, it might be worth talking about CRL for just a moment, which started as the shared offsite storage facility for a small group of Midwestern institutions, the Midwest Interlibrary Center. And as this shared offsite center grew in scale and scope, lots of other non-members wanted to borrow items from the Midwest Interlibrary Center. And what we saw, looking backwards, is a free rider problem, that the set of institutions that was supporting the Midwest Center was not the same as the set of institutions that benefited from its existence. And that began to cause some tensions, and the solution that they came up with, which I think in retrospect was a wise one, was to basically nationalize the mission of the center, shift it away from being an off-site storage facility and much more about building a shared common collection for a group of academic and research institutions. And in that respect, the mission changed as the footprint changed. And I think this is one of those cases that I'm going to come back to again and remind us that the scope of the organization and the membership of the organization and its mission are necessarily interacting with one another constantly. Finally, I'll just give acknowledgement to shared print. We're seeing so much work on shared print today, these efforts that many different groups of libraries have made to manage down print collections in a digital environment. Efforts to, in some cases, through shared facilities, but in recent years, you've seen growing commitments to just doing this as individual institutions stating their commitments to retention. Shared managing down of print collections has been an important way that institutions are sharing the resource burden with one another. Systems is another area where we've seen a lot of efforts to seek scale, whether it be about reducing redundancy or enabling collaboration, ensuring access. We can trace this back in the pre-digital environment to the Library of Congress, for example, when it was distributing catalog cards to let individual institutions describe their collections and discover their collections more efficiently. We can see this through the way that OCLC created a digital infrastructure, a peer-to-peer network, and the associated business model that made it possible for libraries to bring that, description and discovery work to the networked environment. But as we've seen, the role and the value of metadata have shifted tremendously in a digital content environment. We've seen OCLC going through its own efforts to rethink the relationship between its membership, its value proposition, and its and some of its offerings. And then we've also seen the ILS marketplace. This sort of grows naturally out of the previous two. Many of them started in individual institutions and were then commercialized. The recent transition over the last decade towards the cloud-based multi-tenant ILS models or LSP models have shown themselves to be substantial enablers of collaboration. But in many cases, these are there's a commercial imperative and a competition imperative, that has really shifted where the creation and adoption of advanced architectures is taking place, and has really shifted the marketplace away from community controlled infrastructure and towards a more vended or commercialized environment. This is a really interesting dynamic that we need to continue to come back to as we think about where collaboration happens, how it happens, the extent to which the community controls the collaboration, or whether it happens in a more vended environment. Then finally, I'll speak a little bit about collective purchasing, where libraries have been interested in controlling their spend or maximizing the breadth of their collections, widening access to it. Certainly, we can see this behavior, well in the print environment. One group of institutions where they split responsibility for who buys copies of materials, and then they can be shared as sharing models. LG was perhaps the boldest effort to move this kind of model forward. Shared licensing efforts. This is an important role that many consortia have come to play, where libraries have wanted to drive down price and achieve a variety of other objectives around licensing. And providers, the publishers, the vendors, have wished to reduce the cost of sales by having a single point of contact with many institutions. These models are under pressure today, and I'll return to that in a few minutes. And then I think it's really important today to talk about shared preservation as well, shared efforts to bring together to respond to the preservation imperative. I think HathiTrust today affords an especially relevant and compelling example of not just the value of preserving materials, but also the new kinds of services that community control has showed itself to enable, most recently with its emergency access service. And there are a few consortia like OhioLink, like OCL, that have somewhat similar models of local control and therefore shared preservation of various kinds of collections. So that's just an effort to give you a sense of the breadth of what I think we should be talking about, and I'm sure we could even go beyond some of what I've just been talking about as we think about the ways in which scale has proven itself to be vital and collaboration has been vital, but also in some ways vexed as we think about shifts in the environment. Now, I want to briefly talk about a few different organizational models and some of the limitations that each of these organizational models suggests. What you're going to see here, what I want you to see here, what my perspective is certainly, is that there isn't a single organizational model that's the right choice. It's a matter of taking the mission and the community and matching that with the right kind of organizational and governance model that's suited for that mission and community and set of objectives. And so So let me walk through just a few of these. So in the first place, we have product and service organizations. In a way, this is the most provocative of these because these are the least familiar as we think about the history of library collaboration. But these are becoming increasingly important to us in the digital environment. These are the kinds of organizations that provide a technology-enabled product or service. Sometimes these are organized on a profit-seeking basis, so you can certainly come up with lots of those, but equally they can be organized on a not-for-profit basis, and certainly sometimes even through various kinds of open source collaborative models. Some library collaborations are increasingly offering technology-enabled products and services, and you can think of a lot of those and what they have entailed. And in some cases, I think this is a really important point. They are competing against others in the marketplace. These library collaborations for products, for services, are competing against others, sometimes well-capitalized profit-seeking organizations in a marketplace. And so the point is that in a competitive environment, these technology-enabled product and service organizations, they require a real degree of agility in order to compete successfully. And compete successfully here doesn't mean maximizing revenue or maximizing profits, but rather it means maximizing value to the members or to the library organizations that collaboration is trying to provide for. But agility is something that's not typically baked into library collaborations. This is a hard reality. It's something that a lot of us resist reaching this conclusion. We wouldn't like to believe that this is true. But time and time again, we can see that our governance structures, our membership models, I'll say more about those in a minute, are sometimes not really optimized for agility. Another kind of model, which is equally important and we should celebrate equally for the things that it is good at, is the trust network. We don't often use this as a term, but these are organizations for which trust is actually the most substantial asset. It's an intangible asset, but it's the most substantial asset of these organizations. This is the trust that one member or one party has for another, and the facilitation of trust organizations or these structures actually enable, especially for some of the longest term commitments that we need to be able to make to one another. For example, preservation. Trust is the most important element of those networks, and not trust in a way that is imagined, but trusts in a way that is earned. The challenge here is that when members of trust networks, when libraries that are parts of trust networks, when they have leadership transitions, when you have a new university librarian, a new college librarian, a new dean of libraries, sometimes the durability of the trust and the durability of that trust network can be a real challenge. And so that's just a hard reality that we've seen time and time again. Members often want their trust networks to do more than just facilitate trust. They say, we really trust one another. Why don't we offer a product or service, technology platform? Making that transition is really, really hard because they're often not optimized for agility. They're optimized for trust. And that's one of the reasons why not every membership community or every governance structure that's really optimized around trust is often well suited to some kinds of products and services. Now, consortia can fall into actually a number of different models. A consortia for me is just a group of many libraries that's formally organized. Sometimes it's a membership organization. Sometimes it's really the system office of a university system that provides services like the California Digital Library does, or the SUNY's Office of Library and Information Services does. Sometimes they have central funding and elaborate advisory bodies. Most of the consortia, if you look across the community, most of them were founded during the print era. And that's really the reason that they have a regional structure. Sometimes it's because they're part of the state system, but their regional structure is typically a result of an earlier central objective of moving print back and forth, and some of the ways that at the time that was made most efficient to do. Today, of course, most consortia have licensing activities. Some of them have other kinds of roles as well. Now, any of the previous kinds of models that I've been talking about can be organized as membership organizations. And because we so often default to membership models when we think about library collaboration, I want to take apart a little bit what membership organizations really are, what that model is, what works well about them, and what some of their limitations can be. At a very high level, they tend to be fairly durable, which is to say they tend to be lasting, because there's a kind of peer pressure to stay with the club once you've joined it. And indeed, when they get founded, there's a kind of peer pressure to join the club. So that kind of club mindset, we can mock it in some ways, but it's also a really powerful source of durability. On the plus side, membership organizations are optimized around inclusive governance. Inclusiveness, as we know, is a value that many of us celebrate in the library community. But inclusiveness also has its downsides. It means that it is typically very difficult, not impossible, but difficult for membership organizations to set an unambiguous strategic direction and then to follow that direction purposefully over a sustained period of time. Why is that? That's because when the board changes, the board is elected by the members. And as a result, rather than the board perpetuating itself with those who share a common agenda for the organization, new board members join, and they are very likely to pull the organization in new directions when they do. So this is not no one's doing anything bad in that. That's just a reflection of some of the limitations also of inclusive governance. Another dynamic of membership organizations is the membership fee. There's typically some kind of fee structure, whether it's tiered based on library size or something like that, but it's unconnected from any single product or service that membership organization provides. And while that's great because it gives the organization a form of unrestricted revenue that it can apply in a variety of different ways, it's problematic when members become jaded about whether the value that they're seeing is actually related to the price that they're paying. Sometimes, especially as we see new generations of library leaders come on board, they wonder, well, I didn't really want this service or that service that this membership organization is offering, but I still have to pay the whole fee. And so that's especially problematic when the work of the membership organization is either drifted from its original objective or is no longer suited to what the libraries really see as their own priorities. Now, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the changes and challenges that we've seen. I won't dwell on this too much because I think we're all familiar with a lot of these dynamics, but just to do some stage setting here. We're seeing so much pressure for libraries, and it will only accelerate today as a result of the instability facing the higher education sector in light of the pandemic. We're seeing so much pressure on libraries to realign with the university, realign with the college, realign with the parent higher education institution, to contribute more directly to things like student success or research excellence or community development, community engagement, or to show that they're contributing more directly to those things. And certainly, as I say, in a time of pandemic and disruption and austerity, we can only expect these kinds of demands on the library to accelerate. At the same time, and I've already gestured at this, the commercial competition for many of the services that academic libraries have traditionally excelled at providing, the competitors have built user-centric systems, for example, in the areas of discovery and access, that far outclass some of the offerings that libraries have been able to provide. And that's something that's been a real struggle and a real dilemma for libraries about how to seek the scale that's necessary to compete in for example, in discovery, or indeed whether that's a wise move at all. But at the same time, you're not hearing me in saying that take anything away from the vital roles that academic libraries have today. In everything, here I highlight stewardship and long-form reading and other legacy functions, legacy in quotation marks, but I also think that libraries have an opportunity to transform, and indeed many of your libraries have been and are transforming away from certain traditional roles and services and towards really a new set of engagements and alignments with the educational and research missions of your parent institutions. And so, what we've seen is this set of essential transformations, both on the collection side. Many of our organizations have already moved through some of these transitions. We're along this spectrum a little bit from the left more towards the right on this set of transformations. But it's not just in terms of collections. It's really moving beyond collections in some of these ways, moving towards users, moving towards workflows, moving towards acting more as an enabler or a partner. And so we have to ask ourselves, how do our collaborative vehicles support libraries in all of these kinds of ways? So let me say just a word or two about organizational transformations that we are seeing. It's very clear. These slides were written before. Some of these slides were written before the current set of instability has struck. But it is even more so the case today than ever before that to the extent to which collaborative vehicles can reduce the membership fee burden on academic libraries, this is a key driver in the transformation of collaborative organizations. We've already seen previous to this moment a variety of different mergers and closures of collaborative vehicles and many more types of pivots. Some of these are a little bit more focused on the publishing sector. Some of them are more focused on the library sector. Lots and lots of consortia that I haven't even tried to name here have been pivoting or expanding their services or transforming their service offerings in one way or another. So I'd like to conclude with just three sets of observations, one about finances, one about structure, and one about the role of the board as we think about our collaborative vehicles. As we think about finances, this is an area that is not just about the budget, but also, to my mind, about the value. So as I think about it, the value of any enterprise's work, any for-profit competitor, a library itself, a university, the value of any enterprise's existing work often tends to decline with time. There's more competition. The previous work is seen as more like table stakes for what the community needs, and we often see demand for new kinds of services, new kinds of service models that meet the present needs and the future needs. One of the special challenges in terms of the ability for library collaborations to demonstrate value is that some of the most substantial promise of collaborations come when libraries transform their own work, their own staffing, their own structure to actually plug themselves into a set of collaborations. And it is very, very hard, harder than most library leaders would acknowledge, to actually make those kinds of transformations to take advantage of the kinds of scale that they know they need. This is a real dilemma in terms of how libraries engage collaboratively with one another. And so what we've seen among many consortia and collaboration is a pressure to show value, a pressure to differentiate themselves against other consortia and other collaborations, but where there are some real constraints on the ability to do that for reasons that I've been speaking about throughout the presentation. At the same time, the scrutiny of library budgets, even before the current crisis, had been growing. There's very, very clearly from a library perspective, very, very clearly a membership. We value these memberships in which we participate, and to what extent should we continue them? What are the ones that have value? What are the ones that are no longer fit to purpose? What are the ones where we can leave the club? But I think it's extremely important also to say this. Collaborative undertakings require not only financial stability, and not only financial stability on an operating level, but they themselves need to be capitalized well enough to innovate. And one of the things that I think is sometimes very short-sighted is when we don't provide our collaborative vehicles with steady access to the working capital that they need in order to be prepared to reinvest and innovate in their offerings. And so I think that we need to think about funding collaborations that we believe in, not just to provide for today's operations, but also with the working capital that they need in order to innovate on libraries' behalf. I want to talk about structure as well. We have seen a proliferation in recent years of collaborations in the library. And I'm going to say very directly that I do not believe this is good for anyone. Library profession has chosen to recognize and reward leaders for creating new organizations. There is a kind of glory that is awarded to founders. But we are not working in a venture-funded environment where there is any private returns or should be any private returns to founding collaborations. And this decision to reward leaders for creating organizations and to disdain them for having to close them or merge them is a mistake. The recent wave of mergers and closures should probably continue. It probably will continue. We should really celebrate those leaders that have the vision and boldness to be willing to wind down responsibly collaborations that don't make sense anymore, to merge them in ways that are in the best interest of the library community. And even if that means that there are fewer board seats and fewer CEO roles, to really think hard about what's in the best collective interest, and to do so in a way that accords with long-term planning, that takes responsibility for ongoing services needs, but that recognizes the value and the hard work and the labor associated with winding down organizations that are no longer fit to purpose. At the same time, I hope it's clear that we have a dilemma between agility and inclusion. I'm not going to try to recommend that there's an easy answer to this. But when inclusively governed trust networks are asked to deliver efficiently in a competitive environment, it's not easy to do both of those things. In fact, I would submit to you that it's impossible to do both. And some of our membership organizations in our community that are inclusively governed and are failing to deliver efficiently in a competitive environment, I feel sympathy for. And I don't feel disdain for their leaders. I think it's a very, very difficult situation that libraries put those organizations in. And we have to be clear about what is fair to ask organizations to do and what is not. And we need to set up organizations that are governed and managed in the way and led in the ways that for the products, for the services, or for the trust that we actually need to have. I hope I've made clear my view that membership models are typically ill-suited to product organizations and marketplace competition, and that we have to make decisions about whether to optimize a given organization either for strategic agility or for inclusive governance. That's a really hard dilemma because we often wish we could do both at the same time. We're going to conclude with a few observations about governance. And here I really mean both of the CEO as well as of the of the board. So thinking about the selection of the CEO, I think one question that I've seen arise again and again is whether the board has sufficient alignment on the purpose of the organization to make a strong hire that matches that clarity of purpose. My belief is that in many cases that is absent. And I think that that's a hard reality for boards to face when they often are not coming together around the idea that they should have ongoing alignment on organizational purpose. I think another question is whether the board, which is typically in this environment made up of library directors, whether they're prepared to delegate strategy and spending to a CEO. There are many, many library collaborations that have a title that is executive director or some other CEO sounding title, where what the board is actually looking for in practice, I don't mean in terms of what they write in a job description, but what they're really looking for in practice is a strong project manager, strong program manager. And I think that kind of clarity is very, very often uncomfortable and absent. No one wants to be micromanaged, and especially if they're given a title like executive director or CEO. And no one likes to be micromanaged, especially if they're going to have 10 or 15 supervisors. And I think that recognizing those dynamics and for the board to put themselves in the shoes of the CEO, who inevitably has a very different job than the job of a library director at a single institution, is a kind of sympathy and understanding that we need to see more of about how different that role actually is. And then to think about in a recruiting process, what it is that motivates a strong candidate to seek a role leading a collaboration, as opposed to what it would seek, what would motivate a strong candidate seeking a role, for example, as an AUL or university librarian. Like, what are the different dynamics that one would be looking for in those kinds of different roles? And then finally, I'm going to end by just reflecting on what I see anyway as being the board's typical role. It's my view that the board's principal role, its primary role, is to provide fiduciary oversight and management accountability. I already said, no one likes to be micromanaged, least of all by a board of 10 or 15 or more people, where you have 10 or 15 or more micromanagers. But at the same time, board governance should regularly be assessing organizational purpose and strategy and assuring that there is basic alignment at the board level about that. I see too many cases where individual board members are out of alignment with one another, see themselves as much representing their institution as they do looking after the organization whose board they've chosen to serve on and been elected or appointed to serve on. And so I will close there just by saying that, again, organizations, libraries should expect their collaborative vehicles to stay in sync with changes in their own objectives and the broader context in which they operate. This to me is the challenge of not just our time, but really of all time for collaborative organizations. But it is especially important that our collaboratives become single-mindedly focused on the value that they can add today and in the future to the missions of libraries and the missions of their parent institutions, and optimize themselves even when it takes hard choices in order to achieve that alignment. So with that, I will stop and thank everyone for your attention.
Thank you so much, Roger. So this is the moment in the web conference where we just imagine we have 232 people just clapping uproariously for a fantastic presentation, because that's what it was. It was a wonderful presentation, Roger. So there we go. We have some visuals. So for those of you, we have want to take about 10 minutes before I introduce Claire and Mike to give their responses to Roger's talk. And so if you have any questions that you would like Roger to address, just go ahead and send them to me, and I'll pass them on to Roger. So Roger, here's one question. It's actually several questions, but I'm bringing them together. But it basically says, how do we get to an environment where collaborations we engage in aren't competing with each other? How can an organization find its sweet spot and leave other endeavors to other organizations? And are there coercive mechanisms that we could bring to bear to sort of get Consortia I get the quote is to get into line. I'm just quoting the chat question.
Yeah, what a good question. it's my view that if we were better at seeking clarity about the purpose of individual organizations, and over communicating what those are, because I think one of the things that happens is that the founders of a given collaborative tend to have that clarity. But as time goes on, that clarity tends to dissipate somewhat. And even if the staff or the leader has that clarity, it often gets lost in the community to some degree. So some of the work that we can do to communicate kind of focused purposes of every individual endeavor and keep within some of that focus, I think, is one part of that answer. But the other thing that I think is important to say is that the idea that there should be no competition or no overlap is not something that I would necessarily subscribe to. There is a certain healthy amount of a willingness to say there are 2 or 3 different models for this endeavor, and can the community sustain those different models? Or is this a case where we need to have a chance for one or the other to sink or swim? And I think that if we were more comfortable with winding down products, winding down services, winding down things, and more comfortable with the idea that collaborations are not forever, but are for a purpose that could have a sunset, I think that would actually improve the rhythm of that process that the questioner is asking about.
Mm-hmm. So my chat, this is a very good sign, but my chat's basically blown up, Roger. So I'm reading very rapidly and trying to curate these questions.
Of
the
course.
first one that I think is really quite terrific, and I'm going to capture all these questions later, so that those that we can't pick up now, I'll find another venue to so we can explore them more fully. But here's one that really resonates with me. Being at CRL for only 7 months or so, and previously developing leadership experiences as in a traditional academic library environment. Right, I was in an AUL prior to coming to CRL. And the question is, what thoughts do you have, and how can research libraries develop leaders to participate in boards, right? To work with consortia and to work in a board context, because that's a very different sort of leadership profile than within the research library on its own.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I'm not sure that I have a fully developed answer to that question. Maybe I will in a year or so from. Because I've been asking myself, candidly, I'm asking myself that question. This is the first professional governing board. CRL will be the first professional governing board that I will have had a chance to serve on, perhaps the only one. And so I'm trying to study up a little bit on, what is effective board membership. Thinking about the commercial sector, thinking about, the not-for-profit sector more broadly. And I think that one of the if you, I've had the privilege of attending some of the board meetings of my organization, of other organizations that I've worked for, and when you see what trusteeship looks like in other kinds of settings, I think that's a great opportunity. I think there's a chance to learn from individuals who've served in those roles, also. But getting the balance right between wanting to make sure that you're voicing the needs for your so in this case you're asking about training and professional development, and I actually think that that's a good thing for us to track on and pay attention to, because there's probably there's more work to be done there. I don't think we really train people today for that. And I'll just say that I've just ordered, because I can't get into my office, I've just ordered from Amazon a book that is sitting on my bookshelf at work, that is one of my mentors, the now late William Bowen, former president of the Mellon Foundation, who wrote a series of books about board membership. And I want to reread one of those books, because I think that I think that we need to come at this, all of us, from the perspective not of the library, but from the perspective of this is an organization that needs to be governed.
Yeah.
I think it has to do that.
Yeah, I think it's a really great topic. I think it's something we can pick up maybe next year and maybe offer, make this a topic of another discussion, because I know I'm learning a lot as I go, and I think there's a real opportunity to develop more collective intelligence about what makes an effective board member. And Roger, now that you joined the board, I can say that one of the things that we're putting together, and I think it's the first time we've done this at CRL, is an onboarding packet for new members of the board. So here's an orientation packet, set up a lunch meeting with you and the other incoming board members, and have a lunch with the leadership team, but really just build relationships and have a packet to really situate the board members to contribute, right? But have an onboarding for board members. But I think this is a really important topic that we can pick up more fully down the road. We're just about out of time. I've got one other question I want to ask Roger. You're talking about how membership organizations, they're in a precarious place if they're developing products that could potentially be competing with market players, right? So maybe developing software, these sorts of things. But it's a tricky space to be in. Not impossible, but tricky. But I was thinking of this other quote you had in your paper, which was that the quote is that individual libraries must fully integrate the mission of the collaborative vehicle into their own work, their own staffing, and their own organizational structure. That seems to me to really embed consortial work into workflows and staffing. And that would be a space that maybe is not competing with commercial players. But could you talk a bit more? What does that integration look like? Do you have examples, either in practice or hypothetical?
Sure. So if you think about what it would look like, for example, to achieve the Big Ten Alliance's vision for the big collection, as I think they call it, to really treat the collections of 15 enormous universities as a single shared collection. What it would take to do that, not in a stated way, but in a way that would remake those 15 separate institutions into a single institution, and what could actually be done in a way that reorganized staffing, that reorganized library systems, et cetera, around that kind of a vision. That would become impossible to back away from once you had done that. And I think sometimes we take baby steps in those kinds of directions. Here I'm not talking about Big Ten, but baby steps towards let's have a shared collection. But we often spend a lot of time thinking about what would the exit strategy be for this. How do I make sure that that my commitment is only a 20-year commitment and not an indefinite commitment? How do I these kinds of sort of tentativeness around truly embracing the power of collaboration. And it's because sometimes parent institutions aren't really asking us to become interdependent with one another. They're asking us for efficient, but they're not necessarily asking us to become interdependent. And I think that's there's some real dilemmas there around how do you do that? How would you do that? I think I think HathiTrust offers some interesting examples of a story, at least up until this point, and of how can you embed the preservation of a shared digital collection into the workflows, into the thinking and strategic development of a group of institutions. Now, not all HathiTrust members have probably integrated it as strategically as others have, but I think we can see that quite a number of them have. So those are maybe some examples, both positive as well as cautionary.
Well, that's fantastic, Roger. Thank you so much for a great presentation. I really look forward to working with you on the board and learning as we go, learning together about sort of optimal board, president, executive director relationship. And I think the future is very bright and it's going to be very fun. So thank you for being here today and for working with CRL.
Thank you. Strong agreement. Thank you.
So I will say the one chat came in, and it was just a wonderful line that sort of brings together this whole idea about training for governance and board leadership and participation. And it says, It says, we train for management, we develop leadership, and then we kind of just sort of we sort of just hope folks pick up governance on the fly. We leave that a bit to chance. So maybe there are ways for us to create more learning opportunities not to leave governance to chance.